The title of today's Dharma talk is Thank You, Cruel Adversity. And I'd like to start with a few lines from our practice manual on page 9, the gratitude affirmation, which we read today. And I love this affirmation because it asks us to expand our circle of those things that we feel gratitude for to some of the hardest things that we experience. And the first lines go, when sorrow invades the mind, we find the Buddha's teachings. Thank you, sorrow. So many of us, for the first time that we discovered the Buddha and the Buddha's teachings, is when our story, the story of how our lives are supposed to be, start to fall apart. Those stories of who we are or have been told we are no longer work for us. Or we find the teachings of the Buddha when we suffer loss of a marriage, loss of a love affair, loss of someone close because of death, or a number of disappointments which can bring us low. For most of us, we find the Dharma when life has broken us open with sorrow and confusion. But that very sorrow and confusion helps us find the teachings of the Buddha. But just because we find the teachings initially doesn't mean that they necessarily stick. I know most of us have been touched or have touched Buddhism a number of times before we ever came home to the teachings of the Buddha. The first pain brought us into contact. And maybe that first pain that brought us into contact was relieved by a new love, by a new job, or the urgency became less as the sorrow dissipated. That had been my path, and I know that has been some of your paths also. And we plug along until we touch Buddhism again, or the Buddha touches us again, faced with the reality of our own deep woundedness. And we are grateful for that. We are grateful for that sorrow because of it. It wakes us up out of our slumber. The next line on page 9 are these. Through cruel adversity, we discover the Sangha and the transformation of suffering. Thank you, cruel adversity. Last Sunday, as I was reading those lines, I was thinking about how those lines are really being revealed now through the appearance and response to the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the things that the pandemic has been teaching us is our deep interdependence. We need each other to survive. As Gyome Kabose Sensei teaches, I am the sum total of all things and people. We need each other, not just for food, medicine, or protection, but for the health of our heart. The health of our heart and our minds, our heart-mind. During this time where the whole planet is taking a deep breath and a pause, Dharma centers and meditation groups have seen an influx of new people who have never practiced with a Buddhist group or a Sangha before. Many of the same who have previously discovered the Buddhist teachings but had yet to share the practice within a community. Through cruel adversity, the lines say, we discover what? We discover Sangha, fellowship, community. And through finding that, we find the transformation of suffering. Thank you, cruel adversity. So for today, I want to share some ideas about practicing in community and being part of a Sangha, a fellowship, fellow followers of the way of the Buddha. And today I want to start with one of my favorite teachings of the Buddha from the Upada Sutra in the Pali Canon. Now, the stories of the Buddha and Ananda. So Ananda was the Buddha's cousin, and he was the Buddha's attendant. And he was the Buddha's attendant pretty much from his awakening to his parinirvana. So he spent 25 years as one of the closest people to the Buddha. And one of the beautiful things about Ananda's story is that he walked step by step for 25 years with the Buddha. And at the Buddha's parinirvana, when the Buddha went into final nirvana, Ananda had yet to awaken. And he's one of my heroes. So we have Ananda and the Buddha, and they're taking a rest on their long journey. And Ananda is looking over the assembly that's been walking with them to the outskirts of this village. Some are doing sitting meditation, others are doing walking meditations. And Ananda is thinking of all that they are learning and sharing, and he has this insight that he wants to share with the Buddha. And he says to the Buddha, as he motions to their companions, sitting meditation, walking meditation, maybe some in discussion over some aspect of the Dharma. And he looks at the Buddha and he says to the Buddha, this is the half of the holy life, Lord. Admirable friendships, admirable companionships, admirable camaraderie. And I can see the Buddha looking at Ananda as he's starting to gain some insight and looking at him kindly, but firmly.
This isn't a good show.
You know what, John?
If everybody can make sure they're on mute. So I can see the Buddha looking at Ananda kindly but firmly, and the Buddha replies, quote, "Don't say that, Ananda. Don't say that. The admirable friendship, admirable companionship, admirable camaraderie is actually the whole of the holy life. When a monk has admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues, he can be expected to develop and pursue the noble eightfold path." End quote. When I first read that, I wasn't expecting that. And I also think it's important to notice that the Buddha is firm with Ananda so that he doesn't misunderstand that it's not part of the way. It is the whole of the way. He says to Ananda, don't say that, Ananda. Don't say that. Actually, it is the whole of the holy life. End quote. I bet Ananda was surprised by the Buddha's firmness. I think This is a teaching that is desperately needed in our current world, and one that has always been an integral part of the Buddha way. This is known as the teaching regarding the need for a Kalyana Mita, or Mitra, which means a spiritual friend, a good and noble friend. This Kalyana Mitra, or Mitras for plural, is not something I expected when I first came to Buddhism. Through the filter of westernized Buddhism, the image of selling Zen, I always saw it as a lone journey, the coming out of community into solitary self-reflection, locked away in my apartment from the world. I really appreciate this quote from Bhikkhu Bodhi. Quote, "People new to Buddhism often take the Dharma to be a purely individual path of spiritual development. They imagine that the only correct way to follow the Dharma is to lock oneself up in one's room, turn off the lights, and devote all one's efforts to practicing meditation. However, if we look at the Buddhist texts, we would see that the Buddha again and again stressed the value of spiritual friendships as a support for the Buddhist path throughout the entire course of its practice." End quote. Now, the Sangha traditionally meant honoring the Sangha of monks and nuns and their spiritual support and teaching and their meaning to the broader community. But over time, this definition of the word Sangha, this narrow definition, began to expand, especially as it started to move out into East Asia and then again towards the West. The word Sangha has become more inclusive to include lay followers and even our larger communities in which we practice and live. I like to think that I live in an inclusive Sangha of the fellowship here, and a family Sangha at home, and a work Sangha where I work, and a neighborhood Sangha where I live, and a community Sangha in which I interact, and on until I see the great earth Bodhisattva Sangha that includes all living beings. This inclusive Sangha helps me realize that my practice is a daily practice that attends to all of my life and to all those that are interwoven into my life, from the most intimate of friends to the strangers I have never yet met. This open and inclusive Sangha is what it means when we say in our practice manual, the Pure Land is here and now. And we are now starting to experience an even more inclusive Sangha with this move to online gatherings. Any Sunday here in our fellowship, we would have anywhere from 80 to 100 people attending, and other people who could not attend for work reasons, family reasons, distance. And now all of those people are able to join us from time to time where they weren't able to before. And we have more new members being able to join us because of this virtuality that allows us to connect with one another. So this virtual online Sangha, online fellowship, it too is the Pure Land here and now. And this idea of a broader Sangha, a broader container of practice, this connection with one another is desperately needed now, especially in the West, as we have harvested an unattended consequence of a seeming pathological and religious rugged individualism, which is not just degrading families, but degrading ecosystems. And it has increased isolation, fear, and violence, which only has been exacerbated by our needed response to a global pandemic we now face. The irony and revelation is that the more and more connected we are, the more and more isolated and compartmentalized we've become. Someone's response to the pandemic and how seriously take it can be directly correlated by the news and the social media they frequent. Many of us are so desperate for things to be as they once were before the pandemic, and others even farther back to the 50s when the world was supposed to be how it was supposed to be. The more we cry out for things just to be normal, the longer and deeper our suffering. The only normal in the world is that there is no normal in the world at all. All things, including you, are constantly changing, are continually becoming. In all of this, we find ourselves lonely. And somehow this loneliness feels like a weakness or a failing on our part. The rise of addiction is a direct correlation of this. We know from all current available research into addiction that addiction is disconnection from others and is less a medical condition as it is a social condition. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but connection. Connection to others, but just as importantly, connection to ourselves. As humans, we need to be able to connect, trust, and learn from one another. This connection increases our resilience and our ability to face suffering. Suffering is hard, but alone, it is almost unbearable. And our community during this pandemic has added to all of our resilience in facing what we've been facing. And this is where Sangha, fellowship, comes in. When we take refuge and more formally become Buddhists, we go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. This is known as the three jewels. Each is interdependent on the other to help us to attain awakening. And we can see the third jewel as the whole of the way. Thich Nhat Hanh has written extensively on the Sangha. And it's one of these teachings that resonates with me as part of the founding vision of our fellowship almost 8 years ago. In traditional Buddhism, there is another Buddha to come. And this Buddha is named Maitreya Buddha, the Buddha of love. And Te has taught that the Buddha Maitreya is not so much an individual Buddha coming, but it is the Buddha of the Sangha as the Buddha of love. So how does a Sangha help us on our journey? The heart of a Sangha, the heart of our Sangha and fellowship is come as you are. The simple invitation is the beginning of transformation. It is the Sangha that the Buddha Dharma can come alive within. It is the broader Sangha of the entirety of our lives that we live and practice our everyday Buddhism. Thich Nhat Hanh goes on to teach, quote, in order for us to develop some roots, we need the kind of environment that can help us become rooted. A Sangha is not a community of practice in which each person is an island, unable to communicate with each other. This is not a true Sangha. No, healing or transformation will result from such a Sangha. A true Sangha should be like a family in which there is a spirit of brotherhood and sisterhood. When you allow yourself to be in a Sangha, the way a drop of water allows itself to be in a river, the energy of the Sangha can penetrate into you, and transformation and healing will become possible. End quote. As we do the challenging work of I don't know, or I don't know mind, and we learn to become friends with ourselves and with our suffering, we need help along the way. The antidote of our pathological individualism is not more solitude, self-reflection, but it is to share our vulnerability, to listen deeply to others, and to ask for help, to open ourselves up to the world. Ultimately, we may be the only ones who can heal ourselves, but that doesn't mean we don't need a hell of a lot of help along the way. And the Sangha is that. In the Sangha, in the fellowship, we can learn to trust and rely on one another in the crux of real life. It's about leaning on one another, lifting each other up, pushing each other. It's about embracing each other. It's about seeing each other, hearing each other. It's about bowing to one another and seeing the Buddha within each of us. I love this from Norman Fischer, and he used to be the abbot of the San Francisco Zen Center. He says, quote, spiritual friendship is less about personal connection than it is about helping one another grow faith and goodness.
Right.
To realize, as we say in Zen, our true nature. Sangha friendships are forged and grounded in silence. End quote. Friendships grounded in silence, and this is very particularly Zen, and at the same time, how many of us actually experience this curious intimacy that comes from sharing a grounded silence during our retreats, during our fellowship gatherings, and while meditating, even in a virtual environment. The fellowship, the Sangha, is our training ground to our practice. It is where we come and we are. That means there are lots of opportunities to practice the virtues of patience, compassion, deep listening, letting go of views and expectations. There have been plenty times because you're coming as you are, that screws with me coming as I am. When we all come as we are, sometimes we butt against each other. And that's a good thing for our practice. The spirit of come as you are, or sono mama in Japanese, keeps us steadfast and open. As the old rock polisher analogy goes, all our sharp edges crash against one another until we become smooth and shiny. Come as you are opens us up to practice, to all within the fellowship, within the Sangha family. Accepting each other as we are means we are taking responsibility for our own shit. I love this passage from Gyomo, who teaches at the Zen Studies Institute. She says, in such an environment, we learn to let go of our attachments and preferences, to treat all beings with openness and compassion, particularly if you struggle with social anxiety. This invites you to relax, because if someone has a negative reaction to you, that's their practice. If their reaction is about something you've said or done that needs to be addressed, it's their practice to let you know. You can stop worrying about others and focus on what you can influence, your own mind. End quote. The Sangha is our community, a place of refuge, of learning, acceptance, and a place to cultivate faith in the practice, in each other, and in the way of oneness. It is where we create the Pure Land, here and now. The concept of the Pure Land is a guiding mythic story of our fellowship, but not the more traditionalist view. When we refer to the Pure Land, we are saying that right here, right now, we can live in the Pure Land of total acceptance and harmony, and that it is with the help of the Sangha that this is possible. I've always loved this quote from Rijin Yashuda, and he was a Jodo Shin minister in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and a modernizer of Jodo Shin thought. And I love this from one of his essays. Quote, people say various things about birth in the Pure Land, but could there be a greater birth in the Pure Land than the fact that we are now sitting and learning the Dharma together? This place where we are listening to the Dharma together is the Pure Land. To be part of the Sangha is our liberation, is our birth in the Pure Land. End quote. May our fellowship become such a place. May each of us strive to be Kalyana Mitras to one another, especially with what is going on in our world now. May we each be an integral part of the 5 things that release the heart and bring lasting happiness. And what are those 5 things? They are, first, a lovely intimacy with good friends. Second, virtuous conduct. Third, frequent conversations that inspire us and encourage us to practice. Fourth, diligence, energy, and enthusiasm for good, that we may be good medicine. And fifth, an insight to the reality of impermanence. And I want to close today's Dharma talk with another great teacher, and that is Rumi. And this is from one of his poems, quote, "Stay with friends who support you in these. Talk with them about sacred texts and how you are doing and how they are doing, and keep your practices together. Be with those who help your being." End quote. And finally, let each of us cultivate friendships that the spirit of these last lines from Rumi can come true. Quote, "Friend, our closeness is this: anywhere you put your foot, feel me in the firmness under you." May it be so. Namo Amida Butsu.